Hello, hello, hello. One thing we had to hear non-stop throughout the last few years of post-Brexit Tory governance was the struggle between the ruling Conservative Party and the number of quangos trying to stop government policy in its track. I talked about that a bit in my video against the separation of powers, but the bigger question raised is the matter of constitutionalism. The exasperated cry from the typical small c Conservative is to destroy the quangos and restore the sovereignty of Parliament. Yet, under Starmer's tenure, the quangos have not seemed to pose any obstacle at all. So, the question must be asked, do constitutions really matter, or are they simply masking true power? As you may have seen, this chapter of the video is called Constitutionalism versus Elite Theory. Those of you who've watched my videos before will know that I fall firmly on the elite theory side of that debate, but I think it's only fair that I ignore the principles of elite theory for a moment and first give the pro-constitutionalist argument. So, what is constitutionalism in its best presented form? Well, constitutionalism, at a fundamental level, is the belief that a constitution should be the sovereign authority in the land and that the quality of governance and politics depends heavily on the formation of the constitution. The constitutionalists would say that, in politics, there are various different factions of people with differing interests that aren't always compatible. They would say that the pursuit of some group's interest could come at the expense of other groups' interests. As such, they argue that there should be certain rules and limits on power enshrined in a constitution which is to be held as the highest legal authority. A constitution can either be written and codified, as in the case of America, uncodified and organic, as is the case in Britain, or even totally unwritten and based entirely on cultural custom, as is the case at least of many parts of the British arrangement of power, which relies heavily on unwritten precedent. Any constitution must then be interpreted and enforced, preferably by a politically neutral and legally independent court. Constitutionalists argue that having a good balance of power is necessary to prevent government overreach and tyranny, to make sure the government is accountable, and to ensure the fair representation of different important groups of people in government. They would argue that constitutions not only determine the rights and protections afforded to the citizenry, but are also vital in determining the efficiency of government overall. And lastly, the typical response from a constitutionalist to any encounter with tyranny, bad policy, or political gridlock is to seek constitutional change first and foremost. But how do these ideas stack up against reality? Well, it's actually quite hard to debunk constitutionalism on its own terms. This is because, as a statement of pure logic, the constitutionalist argument is perfectly valid. The issue, however, is that everything a constitutionalist believes about politics is almost entirely wrong, so everything he says about politics is also inevitably wrong. Let's find out why. Unlike our conservative counterparts, whom I generally consider to be completely useless at understanding the true forces of politics, we on the true right have various concepts and observations that stand against the idea of constitutionalism. First among these is sovereignty. Whilst the constitutionalist may argue that King Charles III is the sovereign ruler of Great Britain, as well as his 14 other Commonwealth realms, the true right understands sovereignty to be something rather different and far more real. True sovereignty, as we understand it, means being above the law, holding absolute power, being able to create exceptions to the law, and ultimately answering to nobody other than the laws of nature or, if you're so inclined, God. King Henry VIII was able to go against a millennium of Catholic tradition by divorcing his wife Catherine of Aragon and founding a new state religion because King Henry VIII was sovereign. On the other hand, King Edward VIII, as king, could not even marry the love of his life, Wallis Simpson, because King Edward, at the end of the day, was not sovereign. The fact that both men nominally, constitutionally held supreme power was irrelevant. Sovereignty means being able to call the shots, and King Edward simply was not the man who called the shots. So, what does this mean for constitutionalism? Who is sovereign? Apparently, the marriage between Wallis Simpson, whose ex-husband was still alive, and Edward as king was against Anglican law, religious law. So, was that sovereign? Can a constitution ever really be sovereign? Well, no. Throughout history, and even today, constitutions are violated, changed, ignored, reinterpreted, or even done away with entirely. Indeed, King Henry VIII's divorce with Catherine of Aragon was nominally illegal under Catholic law, yet Henry did it all the same. And yeah, even today, modern constitutions, which some hold to be the highest authority, are frequently violated, yet justified through legal means. What, if anything, are so-called emergency powers, if not a tool for true sovereigns to lawfully violate their own nation's constitutions? Now, when you consider that anything from terrorism to bloody climate change can qualify as a reason for government to declare a state of emergency, it becomes quite clear that your constitution means very little at all. Ultimately then, it should be clear that constitutions are not sovereign and cannot ever be sovereign. Nothing that requires interpretation or that can be suspended for clearly made up reasons is sovereign. True sovereignty, the ability to make the exception, is always only ever held by men. So constitutions aren't sovereign, fair enough. But do they do anything at all? Well, the one thing your typical constitutionalist raves about is the so-called separation of powers, and indeed the balance of power. In their view, the various different factions with their differing interests and different centres of power could battle it out and cancel each other out wherever one faction disliked a policy. If the Republicans hold the presidency and the Senate, or the Democrats hold the House of Representatives, the Democrats could stop the Republicans in their tracks. Or, in the Victorian era, if the Commons wanted to push one thing but the Lords said no, the answer was no. Or indeed, if the government tried to do something grossly illegal, there would theoretically be a Supreme Court or other entity there to stop them. That is the theory. However, regardless of whether or not such a theory was ever really true in practice, that is not the world in which we live today. As Austrian school economist Mary Rothbard wrote in 1978, "It is true that, in the United States at least, we have a constitution that imposes strict limits on some powers of government. But, as we have discovered in the past century, no constitution can interpret or enforce itself. It must be interpreted by men. And if the ultimate power to interpret a constitution is given to the government's own Supreme Court, then the inevitable tendency is for the court to continue to place its imprimatur on ever broader powers for its own government. Furthermore, the highly touted checks and balances and separations of powers in the American government are flimsy indeed, since in the final analysis, all of these divisions are part of the same government and are governed by the same set of rulers." And there you have it. The real issue with constitutionalism. The separation of powers and checks and balances mean nothing when all the different ruling entities are run by the same bloody factions. Whilst the idea of opposing political entities may sound nice in theory, they are today all run by the same people with the same interests. If your politics is simply friends of Tony Blair versus other friends of Tony Blair, you're gonna get Tony Blair. Or if it's agents of the deep state versus other agents of the deep state, you're gonna get the deep state. The uncomfortable fact of modern Western regimes is that despite what they tell you, all the political parties, all the mainstream journalists, all the big business leaders, all the top lawyers, and all the talking heads essentially belong to the same factions who want the exact same things. And so politics is basically one big fat lie. As I said in my last two videos, it's pantomime. The Marxists are basically correct when they say that Western regimes are run by capitalist elites, or these days by managerial bureaucrats in the interest of capitalist elites. They are all moving as a mass to mask their power in whatever way they can, but all ultimately on the same side. Is this not the lesson we ought to have learned from Brexit? The constitutionalist effort from the right was to leave the European Union, which we did. It had been promised that Britain would move away from EU-style managerial bureaucracy and return to something more akin to British imperialism, or at least a more conservative small government. Instead, what we actually got was mass immigration at unprecedented rates, the continuation of the same domestic policies, exactly in line with the rest of Europe, and generally more Tory-flavoured Blairism, though this time on steroids. No amount of constitutional rewriting will ever change the fact that we are run by a hegemonic liberal regime and all opposition is a mere illusion. The Tories, Labour, the Lib Dems, Reform, Democrats, Republicans, the media, the lawyers, the think tanks, so on and so forth, are all ultimately part of the same regime, and thus will all, in the final analysis, push the interests of said regime. Constitutions in the modern day aren't a mechanism to balance power, they are instead a tool to hide it. There is no constitutional way out of that. There is no democratic way out of that. The only way out of it is by regime collapse or political coup. This is what we've got, and we must understand that. Still, there remains one question yet unanswered. If a constitution is a way to mask power, then what comes first, power or constitutional change? Does constitutional change create power change, as the constitutionalists might assume? Or is the inverse true, that power creates constitutional change? Let's have a look. To answer this question, I'm going to take the example of the Parliament Act 1911. I talk about this in greater detail in my video How Lords Reform Broke Britain, and I encourage you to watch that for a better understanding. In short though, the Act added time limits to the veto power of the House of Lords, populated exclusively by Britain's aristocracy, meaning that the House of Commons, populated by democratically elected members, could now push through any legislation it fancied. What this really meant though was that Britain's aristocracy had been formally dislodged and made subservient to Britain's merchant class, the real power faction of the House of Commons. What's important to note though is that the Lords had every right to reject the Parliament Act, as until it passed they still had the eternal power of veto. Yet they did not refuse it, they allowed it to pass, and thus in a way they signed the warrants for their own deaths. The question here though is whether the Lords could have resisted the Act or not. If they could, that means that the Constitutionalist wins, and Constitutionalist comes first, power second. If not, then it's power first, constitutional change second. So why did the Lords let it pass? Well, many simply viewed the Act as inevitable and resistance as futile. But why? The answer to that question demonstrates what true power really means. If both factions were still equal in power, the Act would likely never have passed. However, the merchants had already been undermining the Lords. The merchant capitalists, who employed the most people, controlled the greatest share of the economy, owned most of the press, and even held greater sway with the king, had been running anti-aristocratic propaganda designed to paint the nobility as greedy fat cats undeserving of their hereditary titles, and the wealth that came along with them. People were being sold the idea of liberal, meritocratic egalitarianism, and the aristocracy simply could not defend itself against such ideas. I mean, it's a classic lefty liberal ploy. Tell the people they deserve more, that those evil men over there are hoarding wealth from them, wealth that is rightfully theirs, and that if they only supported the leftists, they would take back their wealth and become rich. Even in 20th century England, the most prosperous, glorious and civilised nation to have ever existed, people fell for this liberal ploy. The offer is simply too attractive for the average person to say no, blind as they are to the actual workings of power behind the scenes. A millennium of political tradition totally abandoned because the merchants appealed to the people's greed and spun a lie that they deserved more. The Lords could have tried to weather such political storms, but when your nation turns against you, the writing is on the wall. Strikes, political violence, sabotage, you name it, the Liberals would have had the working class do it. That's what true power is. The Liberals held that true power, and that's why the Act passed. It is always power first, constitutional change second. You may be able to argue that in some cases a primary power wants to bring in a secondary power to help it rule, and does this through constitutional change. However, still in this case, the primary power is the one who is making the constitutional change, and it's his power first, constitutional change second. Even Britain's quangos, which had for years been fighting against the Conservative government, ceased to be a problem as soon as Keir Starmer's government came in. It's not that they were inefficient, it's not that they were part of a bad constitutional design. Instead, the quangos are a tool created by Tony Blair to protect the regime from having to adopt any right-wing policies it does not truly wish to pursue. It's clear to me that the Tories are part of this regime, and the fight against the quangos was naught but political pantomime. If the Tories really wanted to get something done, they'd have shut the quangos down. Yet, they didn't. And so that's it. The problem wasn't the Constitution, it was the reality of who held power. The constitutionalist does not understand power, and ultimately constitutions do not matter. They are naught but veils designed to keep you bought into some false hope that things can get better without needing the collapse and replacement of the ruling regime. Alas, constitutions are not sovereign, can always be overturned or ignored, do not protect anyone from a hegemonic regime, and always come second to the flow of real power. True sovereignty is always decisionist, and decisions are only ever made by men. Thus, constitutionalism is at best a fool's errand and at worst a ploy to keep you clueless. Constitutions do not matter, only true power matters. Anyway, that is all. I always like feedback, and I'd love to hear if I changed any minds or opened any eyes. In the meantime, I have a Buy Me a Coffee page where you can support me with as much money as you fancy. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, as that's the best support I can ask for. I hope you found this video enlightening, and as always, please like, subscribe, and God save the King.